In the summer of 1976, the small town of Chowchilla, California, found itself thrust into the national spotlight. The peaceful community was shattered by a shocking act of crime that would forever be etched in the annals of American history: the Chowchilla Kidnapping. This gripping tale of terror, resilience, and ultimate triumph over tragedy captivated the nation, serving as a stark reminder of both the darkest corners of the human psyche and the indomitable spirit of the human soul. And it all started on July 15, 1976. On that day, as the summer sun cast its golden glow over Chowchilla, school bus driver Frank Edward Ray, popularly called Ed, was driving 26 students of Dairyland Elementary School. He was taking them home from their summer class trip to the Chowchilla Fairgrounds swimming pool when they were blocked by a suspicious-looking van. Ed, having no choice, hurriedly brought the bus to a halt and was immediately attacked by 3 armed men, their faces covered with nylon stockings. 2 of the men occupied the bus, one of them driving and the other pointing a gun at Ed, while the third followed behind in their van. The 3 men were eventually identified as Fred Woods, James Schoenfeld, and Richard Schoenfeld. The kidnappers drove for a couple of minutes and then stopped somewhere in the Berenda Slough. There they ditched the school bus and forced Ed and the children into a second van that they had hid. Both this new van and the van that they ambushed the school bus had their back windows painted black and their interiors reinforced with paneling. Yep, the kidnappers really came prepared. The Berenda Slough was not their last stop, though. The kidnappers drove both vans for hours before finally arriving at a quarry in Livermore. By that time, it was in the morning of July 16. At Livermore, they had a moving truck buried and waiting, stocked up with some food and water and a couple of mattresses. They forced Ed and the kids into the buried truck via a ladder, and for the next 16 hours, the kidnapped children and their courageous driver were trapped inside a stifling, buried trailer beneath a quarry in Livermore, California. Cut off from the outside world, their existence was reduced to the confines of a dark and cramped underground prison. With their hearts filled with fear, the children, aged between 5 and 14, rallied together, clinging to hope and supporting one another through their harrowing ordeal. Thankfully, this is not one of those stories with a fatal end. Ed refused to sit and wait for the kidnappers to come and do to them whatever they had in mind. So with some help from some of the older children, they tried to make their way out of the buried prison. They started by stacking the mattresses high enough so that they could reach the top of the truck. Unfortunately, the truck had been covered with a heavy metal sheet and then weighed down with 2 very heavy industrial batteries. So even after being able to reach the top, they still had their work cut out for them. But after many hours of trying, Ed and Michael Marshall, the oldest kid of the group, managed to push the lid open with a piece of wood and then push away the batteries. 16 hours after being forced into their buried prison, Ed and all 26 children finally climbed back out to freedom. Thankfully, the quarry's guard shack was not too far from where they were buried. They walked over, and for them the nightmare was over. But for their kidnappers, the nightmare was just starting. Almost immediately after Ed and the children broke free, Frederick Newhall Woods IV, the 24-year-old son of the owner of the quarry, came under suspicion. As the son of the owner of the quarry, he was one of the few people that had access to the quarry enough to bury a whole truck. Plus, he didn't exactly have a clean criminal record. He and his friends, brothers James and Richard Schoenfeld, had been previously convicted of motor vehicle theft and were even sentenced to probation for it. What's really interesting about this trio of friends is that they were all from well-to-do families. I already mentioned that Frederick's father owned the quarry where Ed and the kids were buried. His dad was a wealthy businessman, which is why he could own real estate in a wealthy neighborhood. As for the Schoenfeld brothers, their dad was a podiatrist who was also successful at what he did, not wanting for money at all. However, the trio had made so many bad financial decisions in their short adult lives that they were in a lot of debt. Instead of thinking up creative and legal ways to make money, they decided to go the kidnapping route. But I guess their many debts could have clued anyone into the fact that they weren't smart enough to make money legally. In fact, James would eventually mention that their many debts was the reason they targeted a school bus. They needed to make a lot of money quickly, and kidnapping one person at a time would take too much time to gather a lot of money. They needed to do it big, so kidnapping a bus full of kids that are supposed to be too vulnerable and weak to fight back, was supposed to be their ticket out of their many debts. Anyway, I said all of that to say that the police knew of Frederick, James, and Richard, so it didn't take them time to get a warrant to search Frederick's father's estate. Unsurprisingly, they found the guns that were used in the kidnapping. They also found the draft of a ransom note. However, by the time all these discoveries were happening, the trio of kidnappers had gone into hiding. James was the first one to be caught on the same day in Menlo Park, California. 8 days later, Richard turned himself in for whatever reason. Catching Frederick took a bit more time. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that he was caught all the way up in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. In the wake of their capture, the police found out that these guys planned to contact the authorities to demand a whopping $5 million in ransom, which is the equivalent of about $25 million now. However, their plans took an unexpected turn when they faced difficulties making contact with the authorities, and ironically, they were the reason they couldn't make contact quick enough to demand ransom. What happened was that telephone lines to the authorities, which was the Chowchilla Police Department, were flooded by media calls and calls from families that were worried about their children. So the kidnapping trio could not get through to the authorities and decided to wait until the next day, confident in the fact that they had their hostages buried. But they woke up the next morning to news of the hostages having escaped and decided to do some escaping of their own. After they were all apprehended, it was straight to court, where they all pleaded guilty to robbery and kidnapping for ransom. However, they refused to plead guilty to the infliction of bodily harm. Why? Well, they knew that pleading guilty to that would automatically result in a life prison sentence without the possibility of parole. They must have been coached by their lawyers. This did not stop the court from trying them for bodily harm, though. So they were tried for and found guilty of bodily harm, resulting in 3 of them getting sentenced to life imprisonment without the option of parole. However, this judgment was overturned by an appellate court. Apparently, the appellate court determined that the physical injuries found on the children did not qualify to be considered bodily harm under the law, so the 3 guys were resentenced to life with the possibility of parole. This was in 1976, and in less than 40 years, both the Schoenfeld brothers had been released on parole. Richard was released in 2012, while James was released 3 years later in 2015. Frederick's release, on the other hand, was a lot more tumultuous. He wasn't exactly the best behaved incarcerated person. He kept applying for parole, but by 2019, he had been denied parole 19 times. And the reasons for the denial included everything from constantly talking about his crime as if it wasn't as terrible as it actually was, to being in possession of contraband items like cell phones and pornography. It was also found out that he had been running a number of businesses, including a car dealership and a gold mine, from behind bars. This just makes things worse because he apparently had the smart to run businesses, but decided to kidnap 26 innocent children with their driver. Anyway, he was finally granted parole in August of 2022, the last of the Chowchilla Kidnapping trio to be granted parole. But enough about the bad guys. Ed, the school bus driver, was awarded a California School Employees Association citation for his role in saving the kids. And over the years, many of the kids that he helped save that day visited him to show their appreciation. In addition, the Sports and Leisure Park in Chowchilla was renamed the Edward Ray Park, and February 26 was declared Edward Ray Day in Chowchilla. Unfortunately, he died in 2012. As for the children, many of them suffered from panic attacks, nightmares, personality changes, and phobias as a result of the trauma. Some of them have suffered from depression and substance abuse, and a number of them have been imprisoned, exhibiting coercive behaviors against people. While there's no excusing such behavior, there's no getting around the fact that their experience of being kidnapped and buried underground contributed to their later experiences and behaviors. That said, they did get some money out of this. They understandably filed a lawsuit against their kidnappers. The suit was settled in 2016, with the children getting paid out of Frederick's trust fund. It's the very least that he could have done. Like stories like these? Make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.